Army Reserve makes up about 20% of the branch's total organized units. The National Defense Strategy calls for a greater investment in talent for the great power competition, and a more strategic reserve force could be one way to approach that solution. Jacquelyn Schneider is a Hoover Fellow at Stanford University, a non-resident fellow at the Naval War College, writing about the reserve force in War on the Rocks. Jackie, welcome. Thanks for coming on the program. You start this piece by giving a brief history of the all-volunteer force, General Abrams rolling it out in the 1970s, and then you write, it's time to move beyond the total force. Why so, Jackie?
Yeah, our total force has become the most operationally ready reserve in the United States history. We have an extraordinarily competent reserve that is deployed all over the world, side by side with their active duty peers. But in the quest for an operationally ready reserve, we've sacrificed a lot of the civilian parts of the civilian airman, soldier, sailor, and Marine. And unfortunately, it's left us in a situation where if we're in peer competition, we're not able to utilize the reserves in the way that we could to really leverage the unique expertise that you get from that civilian experience.
You propose three things in this work to complement the operationally focused reserve, and the first is expanding the workforce. How do you mean?
Yeah, so the idea here is to look beyond kind of the active duty guard positions, which are more like the full-time reserve positions, and actually think about expanding what we call the IRR, the Individual Ready Reserve. So the Individual Ready Reserve are people who are sitting on standby, and they're not generally called up unless there's a time of extreme crisis or contingency. We don't use these people hardly at all, but we can actually expand the use of them, allowing another flexible way to bring people in and out of military service without big breaks in service. So the Air Force does this participating Individual Ready Reserve program through what they call the Category E programs. So they have, for example, Air Force Academy liaison officers, Civil Air Patrol, and some folks who work on emergency procedures. And these folks work for basically no pay. They just work for retirement only, and they keep minimally qualified. But then when there are issues that come up or contingencies or crises, you can call them up really quickly. So we've only used this category of reservists really, really minimally. And I really think that we can tap into this kind of more flexible category of reservists to extend our workforce beyond the congressionally mandated end states of what we call the selected reserve or the CELRES.
The second item that you propose is optimizing work for reservists. Again, how so?
Yeah, so what I like to say, they're my little bumper sticker there, is we need to think about, for reservists, it's people to projects, not butts to billets. So in the quest to emulate the active duty, the reserves has created a manpower and personnel structure that is tied very closely to billets. And these billets are tied to military operations specialties, or in the Air Force specialty codes. And these are kind of the divisions of labor within the military. Aircraft mechanic, pilot, intelligence officer, comms officer, but a lot of times these MOSs or AFSCs don't really reflect the skill set that we're looking for in some of these emerging categories like software developers or network engineers or even cybersecurity specialists. So by only looking at billets, we're going to put people in kind of things that they're not quite optimized for. But instead, if we think about projects, then we build what looks to be more like a gig economy within the reserves. And if you think about the project instead of the billet, then you're optimizing these reservists' time. And that's another thing that we found when we look at talent is that, millennials, they're not as concerned with compensation as they are with doing work that's really motivating. And we want to spend more of our reservist time doing work that's really motivating and less time doing computer-based training or the sitting in a chair on a drill weekend. So the idea is to be more flexible about work. And there are initiatives that DIU is working on, this thing called Gig Eagle, and then the Air Force and the Space Force have organizational concepts called the bullpen that are meant to create this more gig-type work atmosphere for reservists.
The third item is one with which you have personal experience, building a database of strategic skills and reservist contact information. How would that work, or how has it worked in your experience?
Yeah, so, funny enough, there is not a database of all these reservists with all their civilian skills. We have like base knowledge about where people work, but we don't understand all the latent talent that is just sitting within our reserve force. So, COVID is a really good example of this. So my husband is a former F-16 pilot. He has used to be a project manager. He's got an MBA, and he was flying for United Airlines when COVID hit. So when COVID hit, he thought, well, I really want to serve. I want to desperately serve. And at the time, he was a Category E reservist, an Air Force Academy liaison officer with like 19 years in. So he's just kind of sitting it out here in Silicon Valley. And he went to DIU and he said, I'm a Category E reservist. You can put me on orders immediately, and I can work for you within weeks. And that's what happened. So within weeks, the Defense Innovation Unit here in Mountain View was able to put my husband on full-time active duty orders. And he's been working on a project to integrate artificial intelligence with biowearables in order to detect COVID potentially 48 hours before symptoms show. So it's a really good example of somebody who was just kind of like living his best civilian life, had all these skills. The Air Force didn't know about these skills. They knew he was an F-16 pilot. But when COVID hit, he was able to, immediately be leveraged. And what we want to do is actually build that database so we can do that in a more responsive way. Right now, we just reach out to kind of the Bro Reserve Network and ask people, can you commit? Can you help? We don't know. And instead, building this database will allow us to kind of have a back and forth relationship and really build that gig economy. And I've actually started that after the article went out. I started a private LinkedIn for Air Force Reserve talent. We have over 100 people with really diverse and interesting experience already. So trying to build a informal database of those skills and capabilities.
Jackie, thank you very much for joining me. It's a great piece, and I appreciate you talking about it with me.
Thanks for having me on.